So this segment is called Data-Driven Action, Next Steps. As many of us are happy to say, and because it's true, I think, what gets measured gets done. We need targets and analytics, but we also need to understand lived experiences and stories, and we've had some very rich ones, which are wonderful. So in this session, we're really highlighting recent innovation in data collection, measurement and evaluation, to strengthen those advocacy and action-oriented efforts. And we have three panelists with us. We have Dr. Rupa Banerjee, who is an associate professor here at Ryerson. We have Dr. Tania Saba in the middle, Université de Montréal, who holds the chair, the Bank of Montreal Chair in Diversity. And we have Dr. Eddy Ng, who is the professor and James Elizabeth Freeman Chair in Management at Bucknell University in Pennsylvania. And some of us in the Canadian academic scene know Eddy from his long-term service at Dalhousie University in the business school, and we're very happy he's remaining engaged with us, even though he's moved to that country south of the border. So thank you very much. The first question, and then I'll sit down, is really about the role of data and evidence. So this is the general question. What do you see as the role of data and evidence in advancing diversity and inclusion? And we'll start with you, Rupa.
Okay. Thanks so much. So of course, as a researcher, my view is that data is key. Data is absolutely fundamental to basically understanding what the needs are, what the deficiencies are, and hence what should be done about it. I guess my concerns are that oftentimes data and the research that's being done in the academic community is not in any way translated into the corporate sector, into the nonprofit sector, or into just general Canadian society. So often, you know, we as academics are doing innovative research, collecting all kinds of data, or utilizing the immense data sets that are already collected by Statistics Canada, for example, and conducting quite complex analyses of a lot of these issues that we've been discussing all day today. But at the end of the day, because much of that research is complicated, it's nuanced. At the end of the day, oftentimes either it's not translated at all, it's simply published in some academic journal and not seen by anybody outside of the academia, or it's translated into a soundbite, which is absolutely not representative of what the full results of the data are. So while I think, of course, data and evidence is imperative, and really, of course, you know, what you can't measure, you can't do, we also have to be very cognizant of the fact that there's so much research and data out there already, and it just is not being translated in the right ways. I also want to touch upon some of the caveats. Perhaps I'll wait until a little bit later to talk about some of the challenges.
Sure.
But I think that, you know, we need to kind of take a more holistic view of the ways in which the data that's already being done is or is not actually being utilized for what it could be utilized for.
Thank you so much, and I think that's a very important kind of question that I think hopefully we'll be addressing through our discussion. Tania, the role of data.
Bon. Bonjour tout le monde. Merci aux organisateurs. I totally agree with what Rupa was just saying, however, I'm maybe older and I'm maybe more cynical. And I would say things maybe more from an organization point of view, so not to repeat what Rupa has said. So it's true. Drucker has said you cannot manage what you cannot measure. So we are absolutely, that is true. Sound management has to rely on good and informed judgment. So we need information, we need numbers, we need opinions to make a decision. But I would like to quote Einstein as well, who said, not everything that counts can be counted, and not everything that can be counted counts. So what am I getting with this, with all of this? I would like to stress out all the emphasis that is put when talking about diversity and diversity management on the business case scenario. We've conducted last year a study with the participation of 1,500 organizations from all over Canada. Four provinces were represented in this survey. And we asked one of the questions for the organization representative, what are the obstacles, what are the barriers that prevent you from managing diversity, for putting in place actions towards diversity? The first question was the pipeline. Why would we do it? We're not sure we're going to find the right persons. I think we have talked enough about the pipeline today. The second reason, and which was even more important, they reported that they could not make the business case inside their organization, that employers and employees were skeptical about managing diversity in the workplace. So how far should we get this business case? Can we really link diversity directly to performance? Studies have tried to do this. However, look at it this way. Is just by increasing the numbers, can you really say that this is what's going to lead to performance? There are so many other factors that need to be weighed in and that are as important as performance, and they're getting you to performance. And one of these reasons, of course, is how about equity as well? How about equitable treatment in the organization, which enhances commitment, which enhances collaboration, which enhances the diversity climate as well, which all leads to performance. So what are we, is data important? Yes, definitely. What are we measuring? This is what is also important as well, and I think the other questions we can go more in details on this. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So interesting. Dr. Ng.
As I've alluded to earlier, a lot of my work revolves around the Employment Equity Act that was put in place in 1986. We refer to it more infrequently as LEAP, the Legislated Employment Equity Program. So over the years, in fact, I've just done a policy paper with Suzanne here that looked at the data, how far we have come along. So I want to talk about the role of data because that's really important, right? So employment equity is actually evidence-based public policy setting. So that's really important for us to know. Why? Because now we have benchmarks. We actually have the baseline back in 1986. The Employment Equity Act was actually passed in 1985. So up until present day, we actually can track the progress of the 4 designated groups. Now, Suzanne and I can tell you, among the 4 groups, they have done remarkably well. When I say well, they have come a long way, right? So women have exceeded their representation, visible minorities, as well as Indigenous Canadians. The only exception would be persons with disabilities. But there's a caveat. It only covers 4% of the Canadian workforce. So it tells me 2 things. One, it is, of course, not universal. It's not representative. Number 2, maybe it's a bit outmoded, right? A bit outdated. So we hear about Islamophobia. We heard about LGBTQ2S. We need to sort of revisit some of this public policies that's been put in place a long time ago. And when it comes down to data, there are 2 types of data. One is mandatory reporting, which is what employment equity does. The other one that we like to read in Maclean's and the Globe and Mail and the Financial Post 500 companies would be great places to work for women and minorities, right? We heard of that. We always see if our own employers are on that list. And of course, I used to work at the bank, so I always root for a particular bank and my own employer, Dalhousie, previous employer. It's great to see them on that list. And of course, these numbers, these rankings are, instead of mandatory reporting, these are voluntary reporting. Guess what? So Google is 100 points out of 100 points. SAP is 99.5 out of 100 points. So they're like 0.5 away. What does it even mean, right? So at the end of the day, we are not exactly sure what those rankings really mean, other than the fact that, hey, this companies actually did really, really well in that ranking. So, like the McLean's, the reporting of the universities, it's a popularity game, but guess what? They got onto that game, they rank well, and now they decide the criteria upon which those rankings come about, right? So in this instance, we have institutional pressures that cause companies to sort of identify what are the best practices. The best practices are essentially what gets counted in those rankings, right? And those rankings are, as somebody had said earlier, a checklist. Do you have a policy? Yes, we do. Do you promote women? Yes, we do. Do you have female vice presidents? Yes, we do. At the end of the day, it's counting, but that's just a practice. But what actually happens in the workplace is a different story. So there's a difference between enactment as well as the culture. So a lot of studies have been done, whether there's any correlation between rankings and what actually happens in organizations. So in this case, rankings can be slightly misleading. If you look at the global best places to work for women and minorities, there's a study that was done last year based on American data that found that, hey, while all these companies rank really, really high, Walmart's up there. So they look at two things. They look at fairness, which is discrimination against employees that are underrepresented, and they look at camaraderie, which is kind of like a proxy for climate, right? Do my coworkers like me? Am I accepted? So on and so forth. What's interesting, of course, is with this type of rankings, they did find that women and men of color tend to actually experience fewer discrimination than their counterparts in companies that are not ranked. So that's a good thing. So it does tell me that those rankings actually does give you some form of a legitimacy. If anything, it forces organizations to act, right? The second part of it, of course, is they found that women and men of color also reported lower discrimination and better camaraderie. The gap between white men and the colored counterparts or the minority counterparts are slower among ranked firms or those that were listed on the best companies to work for. So at the end of the day, while we have questions, which I'll get into later on, about the efficacy or the effects or the legitimacy behind all this data efforts that we have, it is still worth the exercise. All right, I'll come back to my other points later.
Okay, very interesting already. Thank you so much. We're going to zero in on one kind of data-driven issue that we often talk about in this field, which is targets and goals and quotas. And really, we wanted to hear from each of you. How should we set goals and targets? How should these be set, given your knowledge of the data that we have? Thank you, Rupa.
I think that before we can set targets, we have to think about what our objectives are. What are we trying to accomplish? If we're trying to accomplish numbers, then that would set quota targets. If we're trying to accomplish instead inclusion and belonging, then that's a very, very different metric that you're trying to actually get to. So in my research, there's kind of two streams of data that we can target, right? So one is about the numbers. How many people of these various groups are in the organizations? How much are they earning? What rank are they in the organization? How many of them are reaching the C-suite, et cetera? And then the other side is much more subjective. So there's the objective side. And then the subjective side is what we're talking about, feelings of camaraderie, feelings of belonging, feelings of someone asking, how are you doing, right? What we heard about this morning. Those surveys or those kinds of measures are so much more difficult to actually get to. So we have these crude ways of trying to get to that with survey questions like, how included do you feel? How strong is your sense of belonging in your organization? Things like that. But those are very subjective, actually. And we know that there's a lot of self-report bias within those kinds of measures. And I would argue that those kinds of measures are more important than just the numbers, right? It's not just about being asked to come to the dance. It's about being asked to dance, right? So if people are at the organizations but they don't necessarily feel a sense of inclusion, are they filling out the surveys, the employee questionnaires to reflect that? Not necessarily. We know that. And we know that there's also systematic biases in the way that people report or don't report those kinds of subjective feelings of inclusion. So I think we really need to be very careful about setting targets and goals. We also have data that shows that things like affirmative action type of quotas have severe backlash, not just from the white majority male, but also from the minority populations in many, many cases. So we have to be very cognizant, very careful. And I don't have the answer, as I never do, but I always have the questions, which is, what is our objective? Are we actually going to be able to touch upon those objectives? And if so, how? So.
Thank you so much. And Tania, what thoughts had you been considering on this one?
Well, you know, inside, I think the question is always this, the consideration or the question of this self-identification so that we can afterward measure. And always when we talk about measuring, the first issue that is raised is usually, well, we need people to self-identify. If I don't, how are we going to measure and count? So my personal answer to this, and then I'll give you the academic one. So the personal is that when we talk about diversity, the first thing that we are really going against is the labeling, is putting people in categories. And there, the first thing we are asking them to do is to self-identify and stigmatize themselves by themselves. So it is a big question, and before they do so, and if they are going to do so, it's because they are convinced that managing diversity is being done the right way, and that there is some equitable treatment that is going to come out of the fact that they're going to self-identify. So this is my personal answer. Now, the academic answer is that if you want to measure something, first you have to plan something. And after planning this something, you have to set your objectives. And then you have to measure. You don't start by measuring when you don't even know what you are going to measure. And this is where I go back to the basics of what constitutes equity plans in organization. And you have to look at the three main issues that you have to find within a diversity and EDI plan, and then set objectives and measure them. The three areas are: first, access. We have heard a lot of experiences today, so I'm not going to repeat them. So how to make sure that the criteria, you set the right criteria, how to make sure that you're reaching the pipeline, how we make sure that you're feeding the pipeline, promotions, training, etc. So all the access first. You set the objectives, you set your plan, you do your diagnosis, what is not working, and then you measure to see if you have reached your goals. The second area you have to look at is results, because we look at the access. We want to facilitate people coming in. However, the work of diversity is not done. You have to follow up, you have to follow through and see where these people are they getting the right promotions, what's happening with them, etc. So you have all this about the results, what's happening, where are the objectives being that are set, are they being really attained? And the third one is about, again, the culture, the climate, and the equitable treatment, and looking at all the bias in individual, but also the bias in the system, and how the culture has changed. Because if not, again, we are facing backlash, and we are not working enough on communication. People are not understanding. It's again the us and the them, and we are gaining, they are losing, or they are gaining and we are losing. So you have to look into these three areas, set your objectives, and then measure after, and not start by measuring, because I don't think you can measure much when you don't really know where you're heading.
Thank you very much. Eddy, what do you say about targets and objectives and how they should be set?
Okay, so revisiting my favorite topic, employment equity. So employment equity is done every year. So all the companies that are covered, federal government and the three federally regulated industries just file a report, they did a workforce analysis, and off it goes. And then it gets compared to the labor market availability rates, the LMA, which you all know. And guess what? Those come from the census data, which is taken every 4 years, right? So this is all awesome evidence-based decision-making. But guess what? I mean, all of us are academics. We all rely on data. And one of the problems that we have with data is it's looking into the rearview mirror. We are looking at historical data. So earlier I heard, Brian from the TD Bank telling us stats can actually, besides collecting data, do projections. So if we were to collect data and set targets based on historical data, guess what? We are forever playing catching up. There's no way we will get to the equity goals that we want to set for ourselves, right? So why do we keep doing that? So stats can actually do projection. We know that, I'm sorry, but we know that, straight, cisgendered white male are not going to be around for a lot longer. I don't mean it in that morbid way, but the numbers are declining, right? And we know that there's going to be more immigrants, more women, more, just underrepresented groups that are coming into the workplace, indigenous folks. Guess what? We need to look into the future and set targets based on future data. So where do we get this future data from? Now, citizenship, they now rebranded themselves. IRCC, thank you. They actually make projections. How many immigrants are we taking in over the next 5 years? They know the source countries. StatsCan does projections. So do the banks and the think tanks, right? So we actually have forecasts of what the future workforce is going to look like. We have to start setting targets and data based on future projections, not looking into sort of your rearview mirror and try to catch up with past data. So to me, that's really important when we sort of decide to set goals, whether at the national level in terms of employment equity or even for your own organizations, right? You know that when Employment Equity Act was put in place, it was supposed to be reviewed every 5 years. Back in 1995, 10 years after the original passage, Prime Minister John Chrétien actually reviewed it, modernized it, so on and so forth. And then, of course, the next review came under Prime Minister Stephen Harper. Of course, he prorogued Parliament twice. There was a parliamentary committee that was set to study that. And of course, when Parliament reconvened, that actually went away. I'm actually quite disappointed that up to present day, we still haven't actually had a review of the Act since 1995. This is more than 20 years. Now, we know that some of the groups have done fairly well. There's still gaps, but I think there are certain groups that need to be counted because, as Tania had mentioned earlier, the stigmatization, the challenge, of course, is getting people to self-identify. And this is where Canada actually is better than the US. There's a huge mistrust of government in the US. People don't like to share their personal information. In Canada, we rely on the government for everything, right? So when there's an employment equity form, fill out that form. It's good for you, right? If you have a foreign-sounding name, I heard somebody from the United Way said earlier, it's actually going to be an advantage for you, right? So in this case, maybe it's time for us to revisit the Act to see if additional groups should be included. And when the government says now we have to sort of account for, religious diversity, gender expressions, then maybe people will be much more likely to actually step forward and self-identify.
So the complexity of these issues, continues to challenge us, but I'm really interested to hear all of your inputs on this. I guess really now, if so self-identification, we have some issues. What I'm hearing is that if you're at an organizational level, if you have a cultural environment that you trust, you're much more likely to self-identify. And I think there is a lot of research that shows that, which is great. So there is this big difference between, counting and diversity itself and inclusion, right? And as you said, climate. But really the next question, if we think further about data and what actions might we take to actually close the data gap? Some of you, you've already suggested a couple of areas. Can we broaden LEAP to include, industries that are not federally regulated? I'm not so sure about that. I mean, the lawmakers can do what they think is wise. I'm looking at her. But please let us know from your perspective, starting with you, Rupa, what actions can be taken to close the data gaps that we do see or face right now?
So my focus is on immigrants. I study immigrants and immigration and labor market integration of immigrants. And the devil is in the details, right? I mean, you can go and look at employment rates and then say, oh, look, they're employed, they're doing great. Right. That's hiding a lot of very, very important nuance and detail. Same thing with if you just look at wages. So when you say, what is the gap, how are we doing, what exact issue are you interested in tackling? There's so much in there. So I'll give you an example. So, I do a lot of analyses of these big StatCan data sets, and they give us these numbers, right? 10% lower wages of immigrants, even with the exact same qualifications, 30% lower for women, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. But what that doesn't necessarily measure is people's experiences within organizations. So on a research project that I have recently undertaken, I'm trying to look at employers' experiences hiring immigrants. So why is this happening, that this wage gap still exists between immigrants and native-born Canadians? So I tried to bring in employers, private sector employers, to come and speak with me. Yeah, that was easy. I had lots of people sign up, and very few people actually come. And so the HR managers that ended up coming to my little focus group basically said to me, we need people, we need diversity, we love diversity, we're in a skills shortage, everything we already hear all the time. So then I said, well, then what's the problem? And they said, it's organizational fit. We just can't, they just need to fit, like that fit is so important. And I thought, yeah, you just don't even see the disconnect between what you're saying. Right. These two statements basically are hiding your own bias. Right. And it's so clear to me, but it's very, very, to them, they feel like they're really, trying. It's really an issue that they're working on, but it's just the fit. I wanted to get a little bit into the question, which was, what are the data challenges?
Yes.
Okay. So there's a lot of data challenges. For me, one of the biggest data challenges, especially for when you just look at like employment equity data or employer collected data, is who is being included. For example, in the LEAP, we know it's a very small proportion, but also separate from the LEAP, who is being included in employers' diversity data. It's permanent, full-time, stable employees. And so in the same research project, I interviewed another HR director, and he said, we're doing really well. We're hiring lots of people of various minority backgrounds. Our numbers are very good. He gave me some numbers, looking really good. Our numbers are just, our stats are going like this. So then he said, except we do have a large contingent workforce, and we know that the workforce and the labor market is increasingly precaritized, and more people are working on contracts, more and more people are working in a very transient way in the labor market. And those folks are not even tapped in this whole discussion at all. So when I said, so how many of those individuals are, from diverse populations, he had no idea. Because he doesn't measure that. Oh, we don't have to measure that. I don't know. So that's a major data challenge, is that we really are ignoring the larger macro conditions of the labor market, which definitely have segmented it into the haves and the have-nots. And the have-nots are predictably the underrepresented groups that we are talking about today. And that's not being touched. So we're only considering people who are lucky enough to get a job in the first place in the full-time permanent labor market. So that's one. Another important data challenge is, again, the, I guess, mix of quantitative data versus qualitative data. I also am very much aware that when you're talking about public perception and public opinion, quantitative data does very little, and qualitative data is much more powerful, right? We see that in advertising all the time. And yet, as researchers, we often think the opposite way, right? So we have these quantitative results, and if we publicize it to the public at all, it's just a bunch of stats, which may have limited impact on managers and the public. The qualitative research that's out there, in my view, and maybe I'm wrong, I'd like to hear if I am wrong, seems to be publicized less.
So interesting, and this qualitative-quantitative debate kind of animates a lot of our field. Thank you so much for that. And when you're talking about the precarious workforce as well, you know, in Winnipeg, where I'm from, we have the headquarters of Skip the Dishes, and this is a very precarious workforce, right? It's very temporary, and you know, not very well paid, et cetera, but it's very large. It's very popular. We were looking at data challenges and actions that can be taken to close the data gap. But the last question, so maybe we should bridge into our last question, because we talked quite a lot about challenges, is how are companies using data to drive change? In your experience with your research, how are companies using data to drive change in the workplace?
Looking at the question again, you can look at how companies are using research data out there, and I think Rupa answered the question very well. What makes me sometimes very, very sad is looking at all the data that's being collected by the organization. And you ask them, okay, do you have an organizational climate survey or else, and they do it very often every 6 months. I said, okay, so what are the results? Oh, 75% of our employees are satisfied or very satisfied. Okay, and well, that's it. So it's like all this data that's being gathered, that's only being analyzed in a very descriptive way that doesn't say much. And I have, you know, I want to have some fun. So I said, and what about these 30% or 25% that are dissatisfied? If they are your higher performers, or they are those who have, you know, these are the core competencies that you definitely need, and they are on the verge of leaving. So what would this 75% say exactly? So far, a lot of the data that's been gathered inside the organization usually is used in a very descriptive way, or sometimes just binary, like using another, sometimes maybe on intersectionality or satisfaction and age, satisfaction and gender, or something like this, but doesn't go beyond that, doesn't go into explaining phenomena, explaining what is happening, explaining why is climate not being up to what we expect, etc. So my insight to this is that maybe they need to go see some researchers, because researchers want the data and organizations are collecting it. So maybe it's a great way of, you know, bridging the gap by bridging, you know, the distance between some of the practitioners and some of the academics. I'm sure that they would be glad to do this. And again, I think that it's very important to look at both quantitative and qualitative data. And for sure, looking at diversity, you need to go further than just, you know, explaining some associations and understanding more about phenomenon. And this is why you need storytelling, etc.
Thank you. And Eddy, I want to hear your take on that question. I guess I would also, I'm hearing some messages about translating the academic data for use in the companies, which is an ongoing challenge for us, and, you know, making sure that not only our quantitative data, but our case studies are published and translated in a way that people can use them well. But Eddy, so how are companies using data to drive change? Do you have examples?
All right, so we know that the two sources of data, which I've described earlier, mandatory data that companies collect and file with the government for compliance, and they fill out surveys for the great companies to work for. They do internal surveys, but there's a third source of data that you guys are not using. Now, I'm just echoing what, my colleagues here said. Essentially, we generate data that nobody uses. As an example, I love the study that Rupa had done. She actually did the whole, foreign-sounding name getting less callbacks. Guess what? As a result of her study, companies now do name-blind hirings, right? They remove any identifying identities. That's a source of data that people don't use. Another example. Now, we often know that we expect that women support other women. In fact, Madeleine Albright said there's a special place in hell for women that don't support other women, right? Same thing for visible minorities. Why is it that some visible minorities don't support other visible minorities? Now, we have data that tells us where the gaps are. It tells us that we have a problem. But we haven't actually found data that explain to us how to fix those problems. The micro-level processes, the relational processes. Now, why is it that minorities don't help other minorities? Why is it that women don't help other women? This goes beyond the queen bee syndrome. There's sort of the stigmatization we've heard of. There's sort of the competitive threat. There's sort of, I don't want to be accused of in-group biases. Those things are really important, not to kind of publicize my own research. I have a paper that's under review right now that looked at if the CEO is a white male, who is the right person to implement diversity? Should it be a minority person? Should it be a woman? So it's a 2x2 sort of, if you can get what I'm trying to explain here. So it's really important for us to understand, how do we use research like that we all generate, right? So a lot of us do experimental studies. Those findings are pretty powerful, even though they're not national, they may not be self-reports from the companies. We use student samples, but as humans, we all behave roughly the same way. Our values don't really change much. So, if you, and the best thing about this, of course, is in a tightly controlled experiment, people really behave or tell you how they would behave in a real setting. Whereas if you were to do surveys, as Tania and Rupa had mentioned earlier, social desirability bias tend to cloud the survey responses, right? So to me, look into the research that's being done out of the Diversity Institute. Go to Google Scholar. You can find a lot of research that we produce. We would love to actually tell you what we do. And if you would invite us into your firm, we can actually help you by collecting data. And I know this sounds like a sales push for data, but we love that kind of data as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yes, access is very, very important for our research, right? Having that access, and also for qualitative work, and also producing it in different forms. So reports like Wendy's Institute produces, like the Black Experience Project. These are really rich sources of data that come from storytelling and the non-quantitative side.